Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The four of you have been a superb panel. And what's striking about it is normally in this room, we're talking about numbers and we're talking about tax law and charts and graphs. And what you all have driven home and why we're so appreciative, Mr. Chairman, of your holding this hearing is that it always comes back to people. It always comes back to individuals and young women. Ms. Graves, you have delivered the wake-up call. You have conveyed the urgency of reform this morning. I'm told by the staff that you want to go to law school. I got to say, the bad guys better look out if you're going to be a lawyer, and we're very appreciative of the good work that you do. Now, here's what it comes down to for me, and I think what really sparks Senator Portman and a number of colleagues are supporting this bill, is in much of the country today, if a girl is found in the custody of a so-called pimp or even a John, she is not considered to be a victim of abuse. And that's just wrong. It defies common sense, and that's right at the heart of our bill, is to amend federal law to make sure that in every corner of the country, child victims of sex trafficking are considered as victims of abuse and neglect. Now, one of the other provisions speaks to a concern you all have described today, and a number of senators have asked about it, is we've got to get additional resources for treatment and for services. And it was our view, as Senator Portman and I were trying to put this bill together and talking to senators, that because we don't really have good numbers today about how many young women are being trafficked, that makes it harder to make the case to legislators and policymakers for getting the money for services and treatment. What's your take on that? When we get the numbers, and the idea is to finally have the annual state report so that, because some states do it, other states don't, we get the numbers on the children identified as suspected victims of trafficking. Will that help us make the case for additional money for services and perhaps for our middle two witnesses, Ms. Guyman and Ms. Goldfarb? What's your take on that? Will that help us get the dollars that we need for these treatment services that you all speak so eloquently about?
I think that if one young woman is sexually exploited, that's enough to make a case. I know in Los Angeles County, we're always asked the question about the numbers. On average, we have about 200 young women a year who are arrested and brought into juvenile justice. As I said, child welfare has recorded 70 thus far. In our juvenile hall outreach programs, we had, over the past year, we had 37 young women disclose that they were being sexually exploited, that were never arrested for sexual exploitation and that we had not identified. We also had in 2010, from our 18 to 24-year-old population, in 1 year, 2,341 young women arrested for a prostitution-related offense. So when people ask about the numbers, I say anywhere between 37 and 2,351. And again, that one young woman goes through this experience is, I think, enough to build a case that they are in need of services and support throughout all of our systems.
Ms. Goldfarb, you want to add to that?
So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, because in order to know what the numbers are, you have to increase awareness, which you hope will result in identification. But once you've identified an exploited youth, we need to be ready to provide the services that that child requires. So waiting for the numbers will leave us with a dilemma. So I think there has to be capacity building at the same time that we're very deliberately making sure that professionals across disciplines are able to recognize these kids and report them. I think that there are opportunities to build capacity within existing organizations. It's not necessarily creating lots of new systems, but I worry, as Michelle does, that if we wait until we have the numbers, that kids will continue to be harmed. And if we recognize their abuse and we're not able to provide the support they need, what's the message there? Then we let them down yet again.
It's a very, very powerful point, and clearly when one child, just one young girl, falls between the cracks, that's one too many. And I think what we're looking for are the tools to try to figure out how to make the case. If I can just squeeze in one additional question, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Katz, you all in Connecticut seem to have really figured out how to put together a comprehensive strategy. So when jurisdictions, local jurisdictions around the country say, gee, we really don't know how to fix this, or we can't get started, you all seem to have figured that out. How'd you do it? What are the lessons for everybody else?
Well, I'm a little late to the game because I've only been there 2.5 years, and some of the work started before me, but part of it was really shining a light on it and talking about it at every possible venue. Anytime I testified before the legislature, I figured out a way to work this topic in. Anytime I went around the state, I went to our offices, to our providers, to our hospitals. I figured out a way to make this part of the dialogue, and because once it, just like you're experiencing today, once you hear about it, you never forget it. And then you want to know what you can do to help. And so frankly, that was a big part of it. I have wonderful partners at the legislature. I have a very supportive governor. And frankly, I think it really is an issue of just people caring and then trying to be resourceful about it and responsive. It's not easy, and we still have plenty of work to do. There's no question about it. And it's not a quick fix. I mean, that's the other thing, and I think my partners here have talked about that. There's I don't want to say a relapse as part of the recovery, but you're not going to get these girls in and immediately fix everything for them. And so part of the training has to be for people to understand trust. Why should, when you when you find a young woman who's been involved in this system, to expect that suddenly she's going to thank you for everything you're going to do for her and suddenly trust you is really to ignore the reality that she has experienced. So it's a long process, and it takes an enormous amount of patience. And before, if I can just conclude with one other thought, before I was talking about the stick, when I was talking about in rem proceedings, which is obviously a great way of trying to finance some of the things you want to try and do, and licensing at Super Bowl venues, et cetera, there's also a carrot. So we are now in the process of developing specific foster families who understand these girls, whom we are going to train, so that when we find these girls, we can put them not just in shelters, not just in housing, but with families. I'm famous for saying at the department and around the state, I want children having breakfast in the morning with the same person who put them to bed the night before, and that's a family. And so it's really about recruiting specific families whom we can train and work with. So that's where the incentives come in, and frankly, as part of your legislation, if you can figure out a way to help states, to reimburse states for these new models, I think you will do an amazing job at helping to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.